The hands tightened around her throat. The pressure was immediate, suffocating, a cruel force determined to break her down. The cold, unrelenting grip of a man who thought he was in control. Her back slammed against the marble pillar of the courthouse lobby, and the sharp impact sent a jolt of pain up her spine. She gasped, her body instinctively fighting for air, for freedom, but his grip only grew stronger. "Step back." His voice was a growl, filled with authority, filled with hate. "I said step back, now." A crowd had gathered. Lawyers, clerks, civilians, eyes wide with horror, frozen in disbelief. The echoes of the officer's command bounced off the grand pillars, but no one dared move. She clawed at his wrist, nails digging into his skin, but he refused to let go. His face was twisted in disgust, his eyes burning with something sinister. "You people think you can do whatever you want," he spat, his breath hot, his voice laced with venom. "Walking in here like you own the place. Like you have power. But let me tell you something," he leaned in closer, his grip tightening. "You don't. Not here. Not in my courthouse." She struggled, but the officer was strong. Her chest heaved, fighting against the pressure, fighting against the humiliation. A deep silence had fallen over the room. No one stepped in. No one dared to. Because to them, she was just another black woman caught in the crosshairs of a man who had always gotten away with this. A moment stretched into eternity. The air thickened, suffocating, oppressive. The world was watching, but no one was moving. Then a voice sliced through the silence. "Officer, what the hell are you doing?" A man in a dark suit stormed forward, his footsteps echoing against the polished floor. His expression was a mixture of horror and fury, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. The officer hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, his grip loosening just enough for her to gasp in a sharp breath of air. But his eyes never wavered. He was still in control. He thought he was. "I don't take orders from criminals," he muttered under his breath, his fingers still pressed against her throat. The suited man stopped in his tracks. His hands trembled at his sides. His mouth opened as if he wanted to scream, but no words came. And then, a sound. A creak of doors swinging open. The courtroom doors had been thrown wide. Rows of attorneys, clerks, and jurors stared in stunned silence. The air was thick with something electric, something deadly. The officer turned, confusion flickering across his face. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. And then he saw it. The judge's chair. Empty. The officer's stomach dropped. A chill ran down his spine, spreading like ice through his veins. He looked back at the woman in his grip. Her face, once contorted in pain, was now unreadable. A storm brewed behind her eyes, something fierce, something undeniable. And then, she spoke. "You just assaulted a sitting judge in her own courthouse." Silence. A deadly, suffocating silence. The color drained from the officer's face. His breath hitched. His hands fell away from her throat as though he had been burned. The realization hit him like a truck. His world, his power, his control, it all shattered in an instant. The murmurs started slowly, whispers that crawled through the air like fire catching on dry leaves. Someone gasped. Someone else took a step back. The weight of what had just happened began to settle over the room, heavy and undeniable. The suited man exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. "My God," he whispered. And then, the panic set in. The officer took a step back. His heart pounded so loud it drowned out the sounds around him. His mind raced, grasping for an explanation, an excuse, something, anything, to undo what he had just done. But there was nothing. No escape. No justification. No turning back. Because he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. And what happened next? It shocked the entire country. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in any form. This story is a powerful reminder of the struggles many face and the justice they deserve. To every Black viewer watching, your life matters, your voice matters, and your dignity is non-negotiable. We share stories like this not just to entertain but to inspire change and awareness. Now, get ready for an intense and emotional journey. If you enjoy thought-provoking stories with deep twists, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Let's dive in. The courthouse stood tall in the heart of Atlanta, a structure of polished stone and towering pillars that whispered authority. Every morning, people flooded its doors, lawyers in sharp suits, clerks balancing stacks of paperwork, families clinging to hope or dreading the inevitable. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint scent of old wood and ink, a reminder of the countless lives changed within these walls. It was a place of justice, of order. A place where decisions shaped futures. But on this day, justice was suffocated beneath the weight of prejudice, and the air inside was thick with something else entirely. Judge Naomi Carter had spent years walking through these halls, her heels clicking against the floor with steady purpose. A woman of sharp intellect and unwavering determination, she had climbed a mountain most never dared to attempt. Born and raised in the South Side of Chicago, she had known struggle, had understood the burden of proving herself 10 times over just to be considered worthy. She had fought to sit where she sat, had built her reputation case by case, trial by trial. She carried her past like armor, every scar a reminder of what she had overcome. At 43, Naomi commanded the courtroom with the kind of presence that didn't need to shout to be heard. Her tailored black robes draped over her frame, her natural curls pulled back into an elegant bun. Every decision she made was precise, calculated. The weight of her position was never lost on her. She understood the responsibility of the gavel in her hand, the power she wielded, the eyes that watched her, waiting for her to falter. But power was a strange thing. To some, a Black woman in her seat of authority was a testament to progress. To others, it was an insult. A challenge. A mistake that needed correcting. And no one embodied that resentment more than Officer Daniel Reed. Reed had patrolled the streets of Atlanta for over 15 years, his uniform always crisp, his badge polished to a near-blinding shine. He took pride in his work, in the order he maintained. In his mind, respect wasn't given, it was taken. And he had taken it, time and time again, ensuring that those who crossed his path knew exactly where they stood. He believed in law and order, but only when it served the right people. His people. At 48, with a square jaw and piercing blue eyes, Reed carried himself like a man who had never questioned his place in the world. He had the kind of confidence that came from knowing he would always be protected, that the system would always work in his favor. He had never feared consequences because he had never truly faced them. His record wasn't spotless, but it was clean enough. Complaints had been filed, but they had been dismissed just as quickly. The few who dared to speak against him found themselves silenced, through intimidation, through bureaucratic dead ends, through the simple fact that no one wanted to be the one to take him down. And so, he moved through life untouched, unchecked. Until today. The courtroom lobby was a sea of movement, attorneys weaving through the crowd, security officers scanning the faces that entered. Naomi walked through the main doors, her briefcase in one hand, her phone in the other. She had reviewed the cases on her docket for the day, her mind already shifting gears, preparing for the deliberations ahead. She barely noticed Reed at first. He stood near the security checkpoint, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the room like a predator assessing his territory. He saw her before she saw him, and something in his expression darkened. She had never had direct dealings with him before, but she knew his type. She had presided over cases involving officers like him, men who believed their badge granted them unchecked power, who saw her as an obstacle rather than an ally. She had ruled against officers like him before, had witnessed the way their faces twisted when they realized she was the final word, the authority they couldn't ignore. As she approached the security checkpoint, Reed stepped forward. "Ma'am, you need to go through the metal detector," he said, his voice void of any respect. Naomi glanced at him, then at the detector. She had walked through these doors every day for years. Judges weren't required to go through security, they were exempt, a courtesy and a recognition of their status. Every officer in this building knew that. She raised an eyebrow. "I don't need to go through security." Reed didn't move. His gaze was steady, unyielding. "Everyone goes through security." The air shifted. A few people turned to look. A clerk hesitated mid-step. Naomi felt the weight of their eyes, the sudden attention. She inhaled slowly. "I am a judge. I do not go through security." Reed tilted his head, his lips curling into something almost smug. "And I'm a police officer. I enforce the rules." Something flickered in his expression, a challenge. Naomi's fingers tightened around the handle of her briefcase. She had spent a lifetime maneuvering through moments like this, knowing when to push back and when to let things slide. But this wasn't something she could let slide. Not today. Not here. Her voice remained calm, steady. "Are you asking every judge to go through security today? Or just me?" Reed didn't answer right away. His jaw clenched, his fingers twitching slightly. He wasn't used to being questioned. Especially not like this. A security officer standing nearby shifted uncomfortably. He knew the protocol, knew that Naomi had every right to walk through without delay. But Reed was his superior. And crossing him was not something anyone did lightly. Naomi took a step forward. "Move." Reed didn't. The tension in the air was palpable. The sounds of the courthouse, footsteps, conversations, the rustling of papers, seemed distant now, swallowed by the quiet storm brewing between them. Reed's hand twitched at his side. It was instinct. Muscle memory. A lifetime of knowing that a hand on a holster, a shift in stance, a certain look, those were all signals of power. Signals meant to intimidate. But Naomi Carter did not scare easily. She stared at him, unflinching. "I suggest you think very carefully about what you do next." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if the world snapped back into motion, another officer stepped forward. "She's good to go," he muttered, his voice uneasy. "Judges don't go through security." Reed's jaw tightened. His body was rigid, his knuckles white. But he stepped aside. Naomi didn't spare him another glance as she walked past, her back straight, her head high. But she felt it, the seething rage radiating off him, the resentment burning in his eyes. She had won this round. But she knew men like Reed didn't forget. They didn't let things go. And the mistake he was about to make would cost him everything. The courthouse was a machine, a relentless force of bureaucracy, law, and order. Every hallway echoed with hurried footsteps, every office was filled with the scratch of pens against paper, the tapping of keyboards, the rustling of legal documents being shuffled and reviewed. It was an environment built on precision, a system that functioned on rules, regulations, and technicalities. But beneath the polished marble floors and the towering columns that lined the grand hallways, something else festered. It was a quiet, insidious thing, an unspoken reality woven into the very fabric of the institution. Prejudice. Resentment. Power struggles disguised as protocol. And today, one of those battles was about to explode into something no one could ignore. Judge Naomi Carter had always known what it meant to fight for her place in the world. Nothing had ever been handed to her, every achievement, every milestone, every inch of progress had been earned through years of sacrifice and unyielding determination. Born and raised on the south side of Chicago, she understood struggle in a way that many of her colleagues never could. She had grown up watching her parents navigate a world that was not built for them, learning at a young age that fairness was a privilege, not a guarantee. She had worked harder than anyone else, staying up late into the night studying case law while her friends went out, pushing herself through law school, surviving the grueling years of being a prosecutor before stepping into the role of judge. It had never been easy, but it had been worth it. She had built a reputation as a fair, brilliant, and fearless judge, someone who upheld justice without bias, someone who did not waver in the face of intimidation. But she also knew that, despite everything she had accomplished, to some people, she would never be seen as their equal. To some, a black woman in a position of authority was a mistake that needed correcting. Officer Daniel Reed had spent his entire career convinced that respect was something he was owed, not something he had to earn. He had been a cop for 15 years, patrolling the streets of Atlanta with a sense of entitlement that came from knowing the system would always protect him. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences, a man who had never been told no in a way that truly mattered. He believed in law and order, but only when it served the right people. He had never considered himself racist, because in his mind, he wasn't. He was simply a man who believed in keeping things the way they were supposed to be. He resented people who played the race card, who acted like victims, who questioned authority. He had built a career on making sure people knew their place. And nothing disgusted him more than seeing someone like Naomi Carter sitting in a position of power over men like him. The courthouse lobby was filled with the usual morning chaos, attorneys hurrying to their courtrooms, clerks balancing stacks of paperwork, officers standing guard near the entrances. Naomi walked through the main doors, her movements purposeful, her mind already focused on the cases she had to oversee that day. She didn't immediately notice Reed standing near the security checkpoint, his posture stiff, his arms crossed over his chest. But he noticed her. He had noticed her the moment she walked in. His jaw tightened as she approached, his fingers flexing slightly at his sides. He had spent years watching people like her rise through the ranks, taking positions that, in his mind, they hadn't truly earned. He hated the way people treated her with deference, hated the way she walked with confidence, hated the way she acted as though she belonged. And today, he had decided he wasn't going to let it slide. As she neared the checkpoint, he stepped forward. "Ma'am, you need to go through the metal detector," he said, his voice firm, his expression unreadable. Naomi barely glanced at him. She was already reaching for her ID, prepared to walk through as she had done countless times before. Judges were exempt from security screenings, a standard protocol, a professional courtesy, something every officer in the building knew. She held up her ID. "Judges don't go through security." Reed didn't budge. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words, but his stance remained firm. "Everyone goes through security." The air in the lobby shifted. A few people paused mid-step, their conversations trailing off as they turned to watch. A security officer standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering between Naomi and Reed. He knew the rules. He knew Reed was out of line. But no one wanted to be the one to challenge him. Naomi's fingers tightened around the handle of her briefcase. She had dealt with moments like this her entire life, instances where people tried to remind her that no matter how high she climbed, there would always be someone waiting to drag her back down. She had learned how to pick her battles, how to let certain things roll off her shoulders. But this wasn't something she was willing to let go. Her voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. "Are you making all judges go through security today? Or just me?" Reed's lips pressed into a thin line. The muscles in his jaw twitched. She stared at him, unblinking, unwavering. "I am a sitting judge. You know the rules. Now, move." Reed didn't move. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The quiet kind of tension that filled a room before something shattered. His fingers flexed again. His pulse quickened. His ego demanded retaliation. He could feel the eyes on him, could feel the weight of the moment pressing down, and it infuriated him. Naomi took a step forward, closing the space between them. Her voice was lower now, just for him. "You're making a mistake." His nostrils flared. The power struggle was suffocating. Then, as if the universe itself intervened, another officer stepped in. "She's good to go," the man muttered. "Judges don't go through security." Naomi held Reed's gaze for a beat longer, then stepped past him without another word. But she felt it, the seething rage behind her, the way his entire body radiated resentment. She had won this round. But she knew men like Reed never forgot when they lost. And when people like him felt like they had been made to look weak, they always found a way to strike back. As she walked down the hallway toward her chambers, she inhaled deeply, centering herself. She had a full day ahead of her, cases that needed her focus, justice that needed to be served. But the weight of what had just happened clung to her skin, refusing to be shaken off. Behind her, Reed remained standing near the checkpoint, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He had never been humiliated like that before. Not in front of so many people. He wouldn't let it go. Not now. Not ever. And what he was about to do next, it would change everything. The courthouse had never felt so still. It was the kind of silence that was thick, suffocating, the kind that wrapped itself around the air and pressed down on the people inside, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't the silence of order, nor the respectful hush of a courtroom waiting for a verdict. No, this was different. This was the silence of shock, of fear, of something unraveling so quickly that no one could stop it. Judge Naomi Carter had stood at the center of this room countless times, delivering rulings that shifted lives, that determined fates. She had held power in this space, had commanded attention with nothing more than her voice, her presence. But now, she wasn't behind the bench. She wasn't standing tall, wasn't delivering a verdict with steady hands and an unwavering gaze. She was on the floor. Her body was collapsed against the base of the marble pillar, her breath coming in uneven, ragged gasps. The courtroom, once filled with murmurs of legal discussions and the shuffling of paperwork, was frozen in time, locked in a moment that had just unfolded. Officer Daniel Reed had snapped. It had been building for days, weeks, months, maybe even years. The resentment, the anger, the slow, seething humiliation that had taken root inside him, growing into something dark and uncontrollable. And now, in front of an entire courtroom, in front of a jury, attorneys, clerks, and officers, he had lost control completely. She could still feel the ghost of his hands around her throat, the crushing pressure, the way his fingers had dug into her skin, relentless, violent, desperate. The way he had looked at her, not just with anger, but with something deeper. Something that reeked of entitlement, of rage that she had dared to stand in a place he didn't believe she belonged. The moment had happened so fast, yet it stretched endlessly in her mind. She had been stepping away from the bench, prepared to retreat to her chambers while the jury deliberated on the excessive force case she had presided over. But before she could leave, she felt it. The presence behind her. The shift in the air. And then, his hands. The attack had been instant, his grip brutal, his strength overpowering. She had gasped, had struggled, her hands clawing at his wrist, her body twisting against him. But it hadn't mattered. He had her pinned, had shoved her against the pillar so hard she had felt the crack of pain shoot up her spine. "You think you're above me?" His voice had been low, lethal, shaking with something feral. "You think you can sit up there and pass judgment on men like me?" The room had been too stunned to move. A judge, being assaulted in her own courtroom, by a police officer. It was the kind of moment that shattered realities, that twisted perceptions, that made people question everything they thought they knew about order, about law, about justice. Naomi had tried to speak, had tried to force words past the crushing grip around her throat. But he had squeezed tighter. "You people always think you can take from us," he had hissed, his breath hot, his fingers like steel around her skin. Well, not anymore. The world had started to tilt, black spots creeping at the edges of her vision. She had never felt so powerless. But even through the burning pain, even as her lungs screamed for air, she had looked him in the eyes. And she had seen it. Fear. Reed wasn't in control. He had lost it. And that was why he was doing this. Then, the voice had cut through the air like a gunshot. Officer Reed. Let go of her. The spell had broken. Chaos erupted. She hadn't seen who moved first, whether it was the bailiff, the deputy, or one of the attorneys. All she knew was that suddenly, the weight was gone, the crushing force of his hands ripped away from her throat. Her knees buckled, her vision blurred as she collapsed onto the cold floor, coughing, gasping for air. People were shouting. The courtroom, once frozen, had burst into a storm of movement. Lawyers rushed to the sides, the jury recoiled in horror, clerks frantically grabbed their phones, some calling for backup, some simply recording the madness. Reed was still fighting. She heard the struggle before she could fully focus her vision again, the scuffle of feet, the grunts of exertion, the sharp, barked orders of the officers trying to restrain him. Get on the ground. Let go. Stop resisting. Naomi forced herself up, ignoring the searing pain in her throat, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to pull her back down. She blinked rapidly, clearing her vision. And then she saw him. Pinned to the floor, face pressed against the cold surface, arms wrenched behind his back, handcuffs snapping around his wrists. The man who had spent years enforcing the law was now the one being subdued, the one being dragged away in disgrace. She wiped at her mouth, tasting the metallic sting of blood on her lips. Then, she stepped forward, her voice hoarse but unwavering. Take him out of my courtroom. The weight of those words settled over the space like a final verdict. Reed stopped struggling. For the first time, he truly looked at her. And in that moment, she saw something shift in his eyes. The realization, the horror, the understanding of what he had just done. He had thrown everything away. His career. His authority. His life as he knew it. All because he couldn't stand to see a black woman hold more power than he did. The officers hauled him up, gripping his arms tightly as they moved toward the exit. The entire room watched, some still too stunned to react, others finally murmuring, whispering, processing the disaster that had just unfolded. As they reached the door, Reed turned his head, one last desperate attempt to reclaim something, anything. You think this changes anything? His voice was rough, his words spat with the last embers of his pride. You think people like me are gonna let you win? Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't waver. She simply met his gaze with the full weight of her authority. You already lost. The doors slammed behind him. Silence fell over the room once more, but this time, it wasn't the suffocating, fearful silence from before. It was something different. Something final. She exhaled slowly, rolling back her shoulders, regaining the poise she had spent a lifetime perfecting. She turned back to the stunned audience before her, the attorneys, the clerks, the jury members who had just witnessed the impossible. The jury will continue deliberations, she said simply, her voice steady. Court is adjourned. And with that, she walked away. But the world wouldn't forget what had just happened. And what came next would shake the entire nation. The holding cell was small, suffocating, the kind of place where time didn't move, where the air was stale, where the walls pressed in like a slow, merciless vice. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly glow over the man sitting on the metal bench, his hands still cuffed, his uniform now wrinkled, stained with the sweat of his downfall. Daniel Reed sat hunched forward, his head hanging between his shoulders, his breathing shallow. He had barely spoken since they dragged him out of the courtroom, since the doors had slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate. His mind kept playing it over and over, the sound of the gasps, the weight of the officers forcing him down, the cold bite of the cuffs around his wrists. He had been on the other side of this room too many times to count. But never like this. Never as the man in the cuffs. He heard footsteps before he saw her. Slow, deliberate, heels clicking against the linoleum floor with a patience that burned. He didn't look up at first, didn't want to, but he knew who it was. He could feel it. Naomi Carter stopped just outside the cell, her presence a force that cut through the thick, stale air. She stood tall, composed, despite the bruising along her neck, the shadow of his fingers still imprinted on her skin. Her throat was sore, raw from the pressure, but her voice held no weakness when she finally spoke. "Take off his cuffs." The guard hesitated, eyes flicking between them, uncertain. But Naomi didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. Within seconds, the metallic click of the cuffs echoed through the room, and Reed exhaled sharply as his wrists were freed. His hands dropped to his lap, but he didn't move, didn't stretch out the stiffness, didn't acknowledge the newfound freedom in his limbs. She stepped closer, her fingers laced together in front of her, her expression unreadable. "You really thought you could get away with it," she said, her voice even, calm in a way that was more terrifying than if she had yelled. "Did you think no one would stop you? That you could put your hands on me, in my own courtroom, in front of dozens of people, and still walk away untouched?" Reed inhaled through his nose, but he still wouldn't look at her. His jaw was clenched so tight that it ached. Was it worth it? She tilted her head slightly, studying him like something beneath glass. Was it worth losing everything? Your badge, your career, your reputation. Was it worth being the man the whole country is about to watch fall? His fingers curled into fists against his knees. "You don't get it," he muttered, his voice rough, heavy with something unspoken. "Then explain it to me," she said, folding her arms across her chest. "Help me understand, Officer Reed." His head snapped up at that. His eyes, cold and sharp, finally met hers, but for the first time, there was no power behind them. No control. "You don't belong there," he said, his voice low, biting. "You sit in that chair, you wear that robe, you make decisions that change people's lives. And none of it should be yours." Naomi inhaled slowly, absorbing the weight of his words, feeling the familiar sting of them, the kind of poison she had learned to navigate her entire life. "You mean it shouldn't be mine because I'm a black woman," she corrected, her voice carrying no hesitation. Reed scoffed, shaking his head, but there was no denial in his silence. She took a slow step forward, closing the space between them just enough that he could see the certainty in her eyes, the unwavering, immovable force that he had spent his life trying to erase. "You thought that if you put your hands on me, if you humiliated me, if you made me feel small, that you could undo all of it," she said, her tone almost sympathetic. "You thought you could remind me of my place." His nostrils flared, but he said nothing. "But here's the thing," she continued, leaning in slightly, her voice lowering just enough to make him hold his breath. "I don't have a place. I make my own. And no matter how many of you come along, no matter how many of you try to break me, I will still be here. I will still be standing." Reed exhaled sharply, shaking his head again, but this time, there was something hollow in it. "You think this changes anything?" His voice was bitter, thick with resentment. "You think they're really gonna let you keep that seat? They'll find a way to get rid of you. They always do." Naomi didn't flinch. "I guess we'll find out," she said simply. He let out a dry, humorless laugh, rubbing a hand over his face, exhaustion weighing down his limbs. "What happens now?" "You'll be charged," she said, her voice void of emotion. "Aggravated assault. Attempted murder. Assaulting a judge. Your trial will be public. There will be cameras. And you will be the example they use for every officer who thinks they're above the law." His fingers twitched. "You think that makes us even?" he muttered. Naomi arched an eyebrow. "Even? You think that because I'm going down, you win?" His voice was sharper now, laced with something desperate. "You think this is justice?" She exhaled, shaking her head. Justice would have been you never believing you had the right to touch me in the first place. Justice would have been you being held accountable the first time you put your hands on someone who couldn't fight back. Justice would have been a system that never let men like you think they were invincible. His chest rose and fell, his hands gripping his knees so tightly that his knuckles turned white. She took a step back, studying him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between them. "You're not special, Daniel," she said finally. "You're just the first one they finally decided to stop protecting." His eyes flickered, something unreadable flashing across his face. Then, the door creaked open. A guard stepped in, clearing his throat. "It's time." Naomi gave a slow nod, her gaze still locked on Reed. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out of the room, her shoulders back, her stride steady. She didn't look back. But Reed did. He watched her go, watched the door close behind her, and in that moment, he felt it fully. The weight of what he had done. The weight of everything he had lost. And for the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be powerless. The news had exploded across every media outlet before Naomi Carter had even left the courthouse. It was on every screen, in every headline, on every radio broadcast. It filled social media, dominated discussions, turned into debates on every news panel. The courtroom footage had gone viral within minutes, playing on a constant loop across networks, capturing every second of Daniel Reed's violent outburst. A police officer attacking a sitting judge inside her own courtroom. It was a scene that defied belief, a moment that had shattered the illusion of control, of order, of justice. People watched in stunned silence as Reed's hands closed around Naomi's throat, as he shoved her back, as the courtroom stood frozen in collective disbelief. They watched her struggle, watched her gasp for breath, watched her body collapse when he was finally ripped away. And then, they watched the moment his world came crashing down, when he was forced to the floor, when the handcuffs snapped around his wrists, when the power he had always wielded so freely was stripped from him in front of everyone. The country was watching. The world was watching. Inside the courthouse, Naomi sat in her chambers, surrounded by voices. Her advisors, legal teams, public officials, they all spoke in hurried, urgent tones, their words overlapping, their concerns piling on top of one another. Some asked if she needed security, if she planned to release a statement, if she wanted additional charges brought against Reed. Others warned her to stay ahead of the narrative, to be careful of how this was spun. She listened, but she barely spoke. Her mind was somewhere else, running over everything that had happened, everything that had led to this moment. Because this wasn't just about Daniel Reed. It never had been. It was about every judge, every official, every person of color who had ever been told they didn't belong in the seats of power they had rightfully earned. It was about the countless cases that had come before her, the stories of excessive force, of abuse of power, of people brutalized by the very system that was supposed to protect them. It was about every moment where justice had been denied, every time men like Reed had walked away untouched. Only this time, there was no walking away. Reed was in a holding cell now, stripped of his badge, his gun, his authority. The police department had wasted no time severing ties, their press statement swift and decisive. They called his actions a disgrace, condemned his behavior, assured the public that he would face the full extent of the law. It was all carefully calculated, a move to distance themselves before the fire spread too far. Naomi knew how this worked. She had seen this pattern before. They would turn him into the sacrificial lamb. They would act as though this was an isolated incident, a rare outburst, an unfortunate exception rather than part of a deeply ingrained problem. They would hold him up as proof that the system works, that justice is served, that no one is above the law. They would strip him of his status, erase him from their ranks, pretend that his downfall meant something greater. But Naomi knew better. This wasn't justice. This was damage control. And the backlash had already begun. Her inbox was flooded with emails, her phone buzzing non-stop. Some messages were filled with support, with admiration, with gratitude. Others were venomous, laced with threats, with accusations, with anger. The media had turned it into a spectacle, a nationwide debate. People demanded answers, demanded to know what would happen next, demanded to take sides. And then there were those who rushed to Reed's defense. The ones who called it an overreaction. Who claimed he had just lost his temper. Who insisted it wasn't that bad. That he had been provoked. That she should have backed down. That his career shouldn't be destroyed over a single moment. Naomi had seen this too many times. A black person could be killed on camera, and they would dissect every frame of the footage, looking for a way to justify it. But a white cop could assault a judge in a courtroom full of witnesses, and there would still be people finding ways to excuse him. "You need to leave the city for a while," her assistant said, voice low, cautious. "Just until things settle down." Naomi shook her head. "If I run, what does that say?" Her assistant hesitated. "That you value your safety?" Naomi exhaled, fingers pressing against her temples. Her throat still ached, her skin still bore the faint imprint of Reed's fingers, but the deeper wound was the knowledge that, if he had killed her, they would have found a way to justify it. She stood, her reflection catching in the glass of her office window. Outside, reporters had gathered, cameras flashing, microphones held out as though waiting for her to step forward and explain what had already been made so painfully clear. "This isn't going away," her assistant murmured. Naomi turned to face her, her expression unreadable. "It never does." The knock at the door was soft but urgent. Another aide poked their head inside. "The governor's on the line," they said. "Wants to talk to you personally." Naomi sighed, straightening her shoulders. She already knew how the conversation would go. He would offer words of support, assurances that the state was taking this seriously, a carefully rehearsed statement that had been drafted by his public relations team. But beneath it all, she knew what he would really be asking. "How bad is this going to get?" She took the call anyway. Meanwhile, in his cell, Reed sat in silence, his back against the cold wall, his hands resting limply in his lap. The echoes of the day still rang in his ears, the shouts, the orders, the gasps of the courtroom. His mind ran through it over and over, replaying the moment when everything had shattered. He had never been on this side of it before. Never been the one in the cuffs. Never been the one sitting in a cell, waiting for someone else to decide what happened to him next. His lawyer had come in, talking fast, telling him they were working on a strategy, that they would try to argue temporary insanity, that they would paint him as a man who had been under too much pressure, that they would push for a reduced sentence. Reed had barely listened. Because deep down, he already knew. There was no coming back from this. No reinstatement. No redemption. No neatly tied-up ending where he walked away with a slap on the wrist. He had spent his entire career believing that men like him were untouchable. And then, in one moment, he had proven himself wrong. The realization sat heavy in his chest, pressing down, making it hard to breathe. He leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes, exhaling slowly. For the first time in his life, Daniel Reed understood what it felt like to have no control. And for the first time in her life, Naomi Carter understood what it meant to win, not because the system had worked, but because, for once, it had failed him. The holding cell felt smaller than before. The air inside was thick, dense, almost suffocating, as if the walls were pressing in with every passing second. The fluorescent lights overhead cast an unforgiving glow over Daniel Reed's hunched form, highlighting the creases on his uniform, the dried sweat along his temples, the exhaustion in his face. He had stopped looking at the clock. Time had lost its meaning. His entire life had been measured in control, in dominance, in knowing where he stood. But here, in this cage, there was nothing but uncertainty. The door to the holding area creaked open. The sound echoed, sharp against the concrete. He didn't look up. He didn't have to. He knew who it was before she even stepped forward. Naomi Carter's heels clicked against the linoleum floor, slow, deliberate, each step carrying the weight of something inevitable. She stopped just outside the cell, standing still, staring at him. He felt her presence before he finally forced himself to meet her gaze. Her posture was steady, unwavering, despite the deep bruises around her throat, the marks his fingers had left imprinted on her skin. Proof of what he had done. Proof that couldn't be denied. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence between them stretched, thick with everything that had happened, with all the history, the resentment, the collision of their worlds. "You said they'd never let me keep that seat," Naomi finally said, her voice steady, cool, measured. "And yet, here I am." Reed inhaled sharply, his fingers twitching in his lap. But he didn't respond. "You thought you were untouchable," she continued, folding her arms over her chest. "That the rules didn't apply to you. That no matter what you did, you'd walk away clean. Tell me, Reed, how does it feel?" His jaw clenched, his gaze dropping for a brief second before he forced himself to hold her stare. "You think this is justice?" His voice was rough, edged with something bitter, something desperate. "You think putting me in here makes you better than me?" Naomi tilted her head slightly. "I don't need to be better than you," she said simply. "I just needed you to lose." His breathing was heavier now, his shoulders rigid, his knuckles white where his hands curled into fists. "You think you won?" A small, humorless smile crossed her lips, but there was nothing warm about it. "Did I?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Look at what's happening out there. The media, the protests, the threats. They're calling for my head. My name is ruined. My family." He stopped short, pressing his fingers against his temples, inhaling deeply. "You don't understand what this means." Naomi watched him carefully. "I don't." His head snapped up, frustration flashing in his eyes. "You have no idea what it's like to lose everything in a single moment." She scoffed, shaking her head. "Everything? You think this is everything?" Her voice sharpened, her patience thinning. "You still have breath in your lungs, don't you? You still have a roof over your head. You'll still wake up tomorrow and get to keep living. You're still alive, Reed. You want to talk about losing everything? How many people have stood where you are now, because of you? How many lives did you ruin with the choices you made, knowing you'd never have to pay the price?" His jaw tightened, his breath coming faster now, uneven. "I did my job. You abused your power." His hands flexed, gripping his knees, his body rigid. "I was trying to keep order." Naomi's gaze darkened, her voice lowering. "Order for who?" He swallowed hard. "You don't get it. The world is different now. People like you, sitting in places of power, making the rules, deciding what happens. And we're just supposed to accept it." Naomi inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "That's exactly what you expected us to do, wasn't it? To accept it. To accept you beating people into submission. To accept being stopped, harassed, threatened, choked, shoved to the ground like we were nothing. You spent your whole life demanding respect, but when it came time to give it, you refused. And now, you have nothing left to demand." Reed's breathing hitched, but he forced out a bitter laugh. "You think you're better than me?" She didn't blink. "No, Reed. I think I'm nothing like you." The words hit harder than she expected. His entire body tensed, his shoulders drawn tight, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to fight back, to argue, to throw something, anything, at her that would shake her confidence. But he had nothing. He had nothing left. Naomi watched as his expression shifted, his resolve cracking, his arrogance crumbling beneath the weight of reality. She had seen men like him her entire life, men who had spent so long believing they were invincible that they never stopped to consider what would happen if they lost everything. And now, he was drowning in it. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. What happens to me now? She exhaled slowly, tilting her head slightly. What do you think happens, Reed? He let out a slow, uneven breath. Prison. Naomi nodded. Yes. He swallowed hard. How long? Long enough. Silence stretched between them again, heavier now. He ran a hand over his face, his fingers digging into his scalp, his breathing still uneven. I don't know who I am without that badge. Naomi stared at him for a long moment. Then I guess you have a lot of time to figure it out. The words settled in the air between them, final, absolute. For the first time, Reed had no response. Naomi turned, stepping toward the door. She didn't look back. But Reed did. He watched her go, watched the door close behind her, and in that moment, the weight of everything came crashing down on him at once. For the first time in his life, Daniel Reed was no longer in control. And for the first time in her life, Naomi Carter had made a man like him understand exactly how that felt. The walls of the holding cell had never felt smaller, the air inside thick, stale, pressing down on Daniel Reed like an invisible weight. He sat slouched on the metal bench, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands hanging limply between them. His uniform was wrinkled now, his badge and gun long gone, stripped away along with the illusion of authority that had once made him feel untouchable. Time moved differently in a place like this. It stretched, elongated, each second dragging endlessly into the next. He had long since stopped trying to figure out how much time had passed, how many hours had bled into each other. It didn't matter. Nothing did anymore. The door to the holding area creaked open again, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. Footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, each one echoing against the concrete floor. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. Naomi Carter stood just beyond the bars, her posture straight, her presence steady. The bruises around her throat had darkened, the deep purple marks a stark contrast against her skin, evidence of what had happened, of what he had done. Evidence that no excuse could erase. For a long moment, she said nothing. Reed exhaled through his nose, dragging a hand down his face. You came back. His voice was rough, hoarse from hours of silence. Naomi didn't blink. Did you think I wouldn't? His fingers twitched against his knee, his body rigid. I don't know what to think anymore. She tilted her head slightly. Good. He let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking his head. You're enjoying this. Naomi remained expressionless. No, Reed. I'm not. His jaw tightened. Then why are you here? She took a step closer to the bars, folding her arms across her chest. Because I want to know if you understand. His brows furrowed slightly, confusion flickering in his tired eyes. Understand what? Naomi inhaled deeply, holding his gaze. What it feels like to be powerless. Reed scoffed, shaking his head. I'm not. Yes, you are. Naomi cut him off, her voice sharper now. For the first time in your life, you're sitting on the other side of the system you always thought was yours to control. And now, you're waiting. Waiting for someone else to decide what happens to you. Waiting to see if there's a way out. Waiting for a verdict you can't change. Tell me, does it feel fair? His breathing quickened slightly, his fingers flexing against his knee. This isn't the same. Naomi arched an eyebrow. Isn't it? He exhaled sharply, his hands curling into fists. I made a mistake. A mistake. Her voice was colder now, like steel. Reed, forgetting to pay a parking ticket is a mistake. Forgetting someone's name is a mistake. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You put your hands on me in a room full of people because you believed you had the right to. You thought no one would stop you. You thought you'd walk away from it, just like you always have. His jaw clenched, his breath coming faster now, uneven. I wasn't thinking. No, Naomi corrected, stepping even closer to the bars, her presence towering over him even though she stood on the other side. You were thinking exactly what you've always thought, that you could do whatever you wanted and there'd be no consequences. Reed swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His fingers twitched, his shoulders tensed. You thought that courtroom belonged to you, she continued. You thought that badge made you invincible. You thought your uniform meant no one could challenge you. And now that you're in here, now that your name is plastered all over the news, now that even the people who used to protect you won't take your calls, you finally see it, don't you? He didn't respond. His jaw worked, his breath hitched slightly, but he said nothing. Naomi watched him for a long moment. You're not special, Reed. You were never special. You just had the luxury of believing you were. His shoulders stiffened, his body still. You think you're better than me. She let out a slow breath. No, Reed. I think I survived you. Something in his eyes darkened, the last remnants of defiance flickering before something else took its place. Something hollow. Something dangerously close to realization. You spent years believing that badge gave you control over people like me, Naomi said, her voice softer now, but no less powerful. And now, for the first time, you're the one sitting in a cage. How does it feel? Reed exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers to his temples. You thought you were different, she continued. You thought you'd always be protected. But the truth is, the second you became an inconvenience, they threw you away like you never mattered. His body went rigid. His fingers curled tightly against his knees. Naomi studied him carefully. I watched them do it, she said. I watched them cut ties with you the second you became a liability. And now, you're just another story. Just another headline. Just another man who thought he was invincible until he wasn't. He swallowed again, his breath uneven. You don't get it, he muttered. Then explain it to me, Naomi challenged. His hands were shaking now, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know who I am without that badge. Naomi exhaled slowly, tilting her head. Then I guess you have a lot of time to figure it out. Silence stretched between them, heavier than before. Reed's hands flexed, his breathing unsteady. What happens to me now? She studied him for a long moment, then finally answered. The same thing that happens to everyone who comes through this system. His gaze lifted, searching hers. And what's that? She inhaled deeply. You disappear. The words landed like a final gavel strike. Reed's face paled slightly. His body sagged, the last bit of fight draining from his limbs. Naomi didn't say anything else. She turned, walking away, her heels clicking against the floor, each step final, absolute. Reed watched her go, his breathing shallow, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. And as the heavy steel door slammed shut behind her, he finally understood. This was what it felt like. To be forgotten. The trial was relentless. Every detail of Daniel Reed's actions was laid bare, dissected in the harsh light of a justice system that no longer saw him as a protector but as a criminal. The evidence was irrefutable, the courtroom footage damning, the testimonies devastating. There was no redemption arc for him, no last-minute savior, no loophole that could undo what he had done. The system that had always shielded him had discarded him without hesitation, just as easily as it had once excused his actions. He sat in silence as the judge read the verdict. Guilty on all counts, aggravated assault, obstruction of justice, unlawful use of force, official misconduct. The charges piled against him like bricks forming a wall he would never escape. The sentence was even harsher than expected. 20 years. No parole for the first 15. The courtroom was packed, the air electric with the weight of what had just happened. Reed barely reacted. He had already come to terms with the fact that there was no way out. He had felt the moment it shifted, the second he became the example instead of the enforcer. The moment they had dragged him out of the courtroom in cuffs, he had known. The press exploded outside the courthouse, swarming for statements, cameras flashing in bursts, reporters shouting over one another. His lawyer spoke on his behalf, but the words were empty. They meant nothing. The story was already written. As the guards led him away, he felt none of the authority he once carried. His head was high, but not from defiance, because there was nothing left to fight for. There was no one left to fight for him. The first night in prison was the hardest. The cot was stiff, the air heavy, the silence deafening. His last name, once spoken with deference, was now whispered with venom. He felt the eyes on him, the judgment, the recognition. It was the same facility where he had sent so many before. He could feel it in the way the inmates looked at him, the way the guards barely spared him a glance. He had always believed fear was something he inflicted. He had never considered what it would feel like when it belonged to him. Naomi Carter, however, had never been stronger. The attack had not destroyed her, it had cemented her in history. She had survived it, risen above it, and now, she thrived in a way no one had expected. The world knew her name now, not just within the walls of the legal system but across the country. She had become a symbol, not just of resilience, but of justice prevailing in a system that had long resisted accountability for men like Reed. Returning to the courthouse was a statement in itself. She had not been chased away. She had not been broken. When she walked through the halls, the weight of what had happened was still there, but so was something else, respect. Admiration. Even from those who had once doubted her. Her rulings carried more weight now. Every decision she made was scrutinized, dissected, analyzed by those who watched, waiting for a misstep, but she never faltered. She had spent her entire career fighting for the right to be in that seat, and now, nothing could take it from her. Threats still came. The letters, the emails, the online harassment. But none of it mattered. She had already faced the worst of it, and she was still standing. Time passed. Reed faded from the headlines. He became just another inmate, another fallen officer, another cautionary tale whispered in law enforcement circles. His name was no longer spoken with respect. He was no longer feared, no longer admired. Just a man in a prison uniform, forgotten by the same system he had once used as a weapon. And Naomi? She only rose higher. When the opportunity came for an appellate court nomination, she accepted it without hesitation. Her name became one that legal scholars cited, her decisions referenced in landmark cases. The whispers of her name for a Supreme Court nomination began slowly, then grew louder. She had never needed permission to be powerful. She had always been that way. She had always known where she belonged. Now, let's take a moment to reflect. How often do we see power abused without consequence? How many times have men like Daniel Reed walked free, their actions excused, their authority unchecked? This story is fiction, but the reality behind it is not. Justice should not be conditional. Power should not mean immunity. And yet, for so long, it has. But what happens when the tables turn? What happens when those who once ruled unchecked are forced to face the same system they weaponized against others? Reed believed he would always be protected. He believed that no matter what he did, the rules would bend for him. He thought he was untouchable. Until he wasn't. What do you think? Should justice be absolute, or do you believe power should grant exceptions? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, if you want more narratives filled with justice, twists, and unforgettable moments, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.